Picture the scene. You're in an elegant Japanese restaurant. Soft lighting, minimalist decor. The chef, with precise and silent movements, dips a perfectly cleaned shrimp into translucent batter and delicately places it in hot oil. Seconds later, he removes a golden piece, crispy, light as a cloud. Tempura, the essence of Japanese cuisine. Technical perfection, refined simplicity. You bite, it's heavenly. And then someone tells you the truth. This isn't Japanese. It never was. Tempura, this ultimate symbol of Japanese cooking, was invented thousands of miles away by people who never set foot in Japan, in a completely different context. And the real story of how this dish crossed oceans, survived shipwrecks, transformed in the hands of a people, and became a cultural icon is far more fascinating than any legend. This is the secret origin of tempura, and it begins not in Tokyo, but in Lisbon. 16th century. Portugal is one of the world's greatest maritime powers. Its ships cross oceans, discover new continents, establish trade routes connecting Europe, Africa, America, and Asia. And in this context of brutal and ambitious expansion, Portuguese sailors arrive in Japan in 1543. It's the first direct contact between Japanese and Europeans. And along with firearms, Christianity, and maps, the Portuguese bring something unexpected: fried food. But not just any frying. The Portuguese had a specific culinary tradition linked to the Catholic religious calendar. During Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, eating meat was forbidden. The faithful needed to fast or eat only vegetables and fish. And to make these meals more palatable, the Portuguese developed a technique: covering vegetables and fish with a light batter made of flour and water, and quickly frying in oil. Simple, practical, delicious. This practice was called tempero, or associated with tempura, the days of religious fasting, especially the 4 ember days of the liturgical calendar, when devout Catholics abstained from meat. The word tempura comes directly from there. It's not Japanese, it's Portuguese. And what we now consider one of the most refined techniques in Japanese cuisine was actually born as a practical solution to a 16th century Catholic religious restriction. When Jesuit missionaries and Portuguese merchants landed in Japan, they brought this frying technique with them. And the Japanese observed, fascinated, because until that moment, frying wasn't common in Japanese cuisine. Japan had steamed dishes, grilled, fermented, raw, but deep frying in oil, that was new. And the Japanese, masters in the art of observing, absorbing, and transforming, immediately perceived the potential of that strange technique. But here's the crucial detail. The Japanese didn't simply copy. They completely reinvented it. They took the basic idea, batter, oil, quick frying, and transformed it into something entirely new. Because the Portuguese fried carelessly, with heavy batter, reused oil, in large quantities. It was sailor food, church food, functional food. There was no refinement, no aesthetics, no philosophy. It was just, we need to eat something during Lent. The Japanese took this and did the opposite. They transformed frying into art. They developed a batter so light it was almost transparent. They used ice-cold water, sometimes even with ice, to create a delicate texture that melted in the mouth. They fried in the purest oil, at exact temperature, for precise seconds. Each piece was treated individually, with total attention. The result wasn't just different, it was revolutionary. Japanese tempura became a technique where the goal wasn't to hide the ingredient under a thick layer of batter, but to reveal its essence through an almost invisible coating. And there's something deeply Japanese in this. The concept of ma, the empty space, what isn't present, is fundamental in Japanese aesthetics. In painting, flower arrangement, architecture, design. And tempura embodies this principle perfectly. The batter doesn't dominate. It's barely there. It's almost absence. And precisely because of this, the flavor of shrimp, fish, vegetable, shines completely. Its philosophy transformed into food. But the transformation didn't happen overnight. It took decades, centuries. At first, tempura was considered strange, foreign food. Many Japanese avoided it because oil was expensive and rare. Frying seemed wasteful. But slowly, especially in port cities like Nagasaki, where contact with Portuguese was more intense, tempura began gaining popularity. Small street vendors started offering pieces of fried fish and vegetables. It was fast food, worker food, cheap food. And then, something interesting happened. During the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, when Japan closed itself to the world and expelled almost all foreigners, tempura remained. Even without the Portuguese, even without contact with the West, tempura continued evolving. Because at that point, it was no longer Portuguese, it was Japanese. It had been completely absorbed, transformed, integrated. The Japanese had forgotten, or chosen to forget, that it came from outside. And thus, tempura became tradition. For centuries, tempura was street food. Stalls in Edo, present-day Tokyo, sold pieces of fried shrimp and vegetables, served on skewers, to hurried workers. It was cheap, quick, satisfying. Nothing refined about it, nothing luxurious. It was ancient Japan's fast food. But over time, chefs began experimenting. They began perfecting. They began elevating. In the 20th century, especially after World War II, tempura underwent radical transformation. Specialized restaurants, called tempura-ya, began appearing. Chefs devoted entire lives to mastering the technique. They developed strict rules. Pure sesame oil, exact temperature of 356 degrees Fahrenheit. Batter prepared fresh with precise proportions. Highest quality ingredients. Specific frying order. Light vegetables first, seafood after. Minimalist presentation. Tempura stopped being street food and became haute cuisine. Michelin-starred restaurants dedicated exclusively to tempura emerged in Tokyo. Chefs like Kondo Fumio elevated the technique to almost artistic levels, creating tempura so delicate it seemed impossible. Fried flower petals maintaining color and form. Vegetables crispy outside, but maintaining natural texture inside. Shrimp seemingly floating on the plate. And ironically, the entire world began seeing tempura as the essence of Japanese cuisine, as a symbol of precision, discipline, technical perfection. Tourists visited Japan specifically to eat authentic tempura. Western chefs tried replicating the technique and failed miserably because they didn't understand the philosophical principles behind it. Tempura had become so Japanese that its Portuguese origin was completely forgotten. But why did this happen? Why did Japan manage to transform a foreign technique into a national symbol? The answer lies in the Japanese concept of shokunin, the artisan who dedicates an entire life to mastering a single skill. In the West, cooks learn hundreds of dishes, hundreds of techniques. In Japan, especially in traditional haute cuisine, a chef may dedicate decades to mastering one single thing. Only sushi, only soba, only tempura. This obsession with perfection in something specific is what transformed tempura. Because it wasn't just making fried food, it was making the best possible fried food. It was understanding the science behind it. Why does ice-cold water create lighter batter? Because it retards gluten formation. Why fry at high temperature for little time? Because it quickly seals the surface, preventing oil from penetrating. Why use sesame oil? Because it has a high smoke point and neutral flavor. Every detail was studied, tested, refined. And there's a fascinating historical irony in this. The Portuguese, who brought the technique, never developed it. They continued frying the same basic way for centuries. Meanwhile, the Japanese took that simple technique and transformed it into art. Today, if you eat fried fish in Portugal and tempura in Japan, they're completely different experiences. One is rustic, homey, honest. The other is refined, precise, transcendent. And this story reveals something important about culture. There's no pure authenticity. All cultures are mixtures, fusions, adaptations. The idea that something is 100% Japanese or 100% Portuguese is illusion. Culture is alive. It breathes. It absorbs. It transforms. Is tempura Japanese? Yes. Is it Portuguese? Also. It's both things simultaneously. And it's exactly this complexity that makes it fascinating. There's also a profound lesson about appropriation versus appreciation. Japan didn't steal the Portuguese technique, didn't pretend it invented from scratch. It simply absorbed, transformed, elevated. And in doing so, created something new that respected the original essence, but added layers of meaning, technique, and philosophy. This isn't appropriation, it's cultural evolution. Today, tempura is everywhere. In expensive Japanese restaurants, in fast food joints, in frozen supermarkets, in culinary fusions, ice cream tempura, chocolate tempura, cheese tempura. Some traditional chefs hate these experiments. Others embrace them. But everyone agrees on one thing. Tempura transcended its origins. It's no longer Portuguese. It's not merely Japanese. It's global. And there's something beautiful in this. Because tempura's story is humanity's story. People travel, ideas travel, techniques travel. And when they arrive in new places, in new people's hands, with new philosophies, they transform. Sometimes they improve. Sometimes they worsen. But they always change. And this constant change, this infinite adaptation, is what keeps culture alive. Tempura teaches we shouldn't fear the foreign. That different isn't threat, it's opportunity. That the best things frequently emerge from encounters between cultures, not from isolation. That respecting tradition doesn't mean freezing the past, but honoring its essence while allowing evolution. And perhaps the greatest irony of all is this. If the Portuguese had never arrived in Japan, if those sailors and missionaries had never brought their simple Lenten frying technique, the world would never have known tempura. One of the most elegant, refined, technically perfect dishes in world gastronomy wouldn't exist. And this reveals a fundamental truth. The most precious things frequently emerge from unexpected encounters, from unlikely mixtures, from cultures colliding and creating something new. So next time you eat tempura, whether in a starred restaurant in Tokyo, at a neighborhood buffet, or from a frozen supermarket package, remember, you're eating history. You're eating the fusion between East and West. You're eating centuries of culinary evolution. You're eating proof that cultural borders are illusory, that authentic is always more complex than it seems, and that humanity's best things emerge when we stop protecting territories and start sharing wisdom. Tempura wasn't created by Japan, but it was perfected by it. It was elevated. It was transformed into art. And perhaps that's the true Japanese genius. Not creating from scratch, but taking what exists and carrying it to places no one imagined possible. Taking a simple Lenten fry and transforming it into edible philosophy. Taking the mundane and revealing the sacred hidden within it. And this, in the end, is what all great cuisine does. It doesn't just feed the body. It tells stories. It connects people. It crosses oceans and centuries. It transforms the ordinary into extraordinary. And it reminds us that no matter how different we all share the same hunger. Not just for food, but for meaning, for beauty, for connection. Tempura is all of this. In a crispy, golden piece that melts in the mouth and reveals, for a brief instant, the essence of ingredient, effort, history, and of all humanity. Love discovering this secret origin? Subscribe to the channel for more surprising stories about the true origins of dishes you love. And tell us in the comments, did you imagine tempura had Portuguese origins? What other dish would you like us to investigate? We're curious.